In this road, there lay so many dead rebels that they formed a line which one might have walked upon, as far as I could see. They lay there, just as they had been killed, amid the blood which was soaking the earth.
The wounded filled every building and overflowed into the country round, into farmhouses, barns, corn cribs, cabins, wherever four walls and a roof were found together.
I had to wring the blood from the bottom of my clothing before I could step, for the weight about my feet. Clara Barton.
September 16th, 1862. McClellan turns back Lee and his Confederates at the battle at Antietam Creek in the bloodiest day of the war. On the Union side, more than 12,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The South lost fewer men, nearly 11,000, but that number represented a quarter of its army. Upon entering the war, both the Union in the North and the Confederates in the South hoped it would end quickly. But the battle at Antietam Creek was just one bloody day among hundreds in America's Civil War, a war in which more than 3 million Americans fought, a war in which more than 600,000 men, or 2% of the population, died. Nearly every Southern family lost a son, a brother, or a father. Americans displayed bravery and cruelty, ingenuity and poor judgment. The war was long and horrible, and it changed forever the lives of all who lived through it: white and black soldiers, slaves, settlers in the West and Native Americans, professional women, and those who kept families together back home.
Future years will never know the seething hell in the black infernal background, the countless minor scenes and interiors of the Secession War, and it is best they should not. The real war will never get in the books. Fort Whitman.
The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when the Confederate Army began bombing Union troops at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. General Pierre G.T. Beauregard demanded that Major Robert Anderson and his Union troops withdraw from Confederate territory. Men and women watched from their rooftops as the shells screamed over Sumter. The attack at Fort Sumter followed decades of American unrest over slavery, states' rights, social values, and Western expansion. It had gotten so bad that politicians were coming to Congress with revolvers and knives in their briefcases, unwilling to compromise. Southerners feared that Abraham Lincoln, the newly elected president, would end slavery. So they seceded from the Union, elected their own president, Jefferson Davis, and wrote a Confederate Constitution. By the time shots were fired in Charleston Harbor, the Confederacy had 7 states. America had become 2 countries, and Abraham Lincoln was going to put it back together again. Major Anderson and his troops withstood 1 day of intense cannon fire without injury. After 34 hours, Anderson surrendered Sumter. He returned north carrying a ragged flag. The victory cheered the South and set the North on fire. The shot-torn Sumter flag waved from the statue of George Washington in New York's Union Square. 100,000 New Yorkers surrounded it, demanding vengeance.
So impatient did I become for starting that I felt like 1,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body, and started off a week in advance of my brothers. Frank P. Peake, Arkansas.
Lincoln immediately ordered states to send 75,000 men to serve as federal troops. Patriots rallied to the cause. His call put 4 more states into the Southern Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis arranged to move the Confederate capital from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. At its beginning, the aims of the war were simple. The Confederacy would fight for independence, the North to reestablish the Union. But young men enlisted for many different reasons. Some for conscience, some for adventure, some for honor.
If a fellow wants to go with a girl now, he had better enlist. The girls sing, "I am bound to be a soldier's wife or die an old maid." Private Theodore Upson, 100th Indiana.
I tell the boys right to their face, I'm in the war for the freedom of the slave. When they talk about saving the Union, I tell them that is Dutch to me. I'm for helping the slaves if the Union goes to smash. Chancy Cook, Wisconsin.
Men streamed in with an assortment of gaudy and impractical uniforms. The first wave came as 90-day volunteers, another as 3-year volunteers. They elected their first leaders from among themselves. Most had no military experience. Amateurs led amateurs. When they arrived at camps, generals who had never led such large groups were expected to put together troops from these undisciplined civilians. Neither North nor South was ready for war. Both sides looked for leaders among career soldiers, many of whom had studied together at West Point and other institutions. They were classmates and friends. Robert E. Lee was first choice for leading the Union Army, but when his home state of Virginia seceded, he accepted Jefferson Davis's request to lead the armies of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln would struggle with lesser generals for 3 years until he found a match for Lee in Ulysses S. Grant. Northern officers like William Tecumseh Sherman warned their Confederate friends that they were bound to fail. The North had 18 million people. The South had only 9 million. 1/3 of those were slaves. 90% of the country's manufacturing took place in the North. 2/3 of the nation's rail lines and most of the iron, coal, copper, and precious metals were there. Northern trade with Europe was strong. It had cash for war supplies. But the South had its own advantages. Southern soldiers knew what they were fighting for, to protect their homeland. And they knew the country they had to defend. Northerners had to invade and conquer unknown ground.
Men fall. They're bleeding, torn and mangled. There's smoke, dust, wild talking, shouting, hissing, howling, explosions. It is a new, strange, unanticipated experience to the soldiers of both armies, far different from what they thought it would be. Charles Coffin.
After the attack at Fort Sumter, enthusiastic new soldiers waited impatiently to see action. It came for many at Bull Run, only 25 miles from Washington, D.C. Union troops headed for Richmond in summer heat. Confederate troops sent them running. When the battle was over, some 3,500 men lay dead or wounded. Another 1,300 were missing. The Union retreated. The South claimed a victory and boasted the battle had secured their independence. Lincoln quickly appointed General George B. McClellan to lead the Union Army, who organized, drilled, and equipped a formidable force of 250,000 men.
The soldiers must be fed and clothed. They must have guns, cartridge boxes, knapsacks, tents, and wagons. For the closing of the southern seaports, ships must be built. Never before was there such a commotion in the northern states. Charles Coffin.
During the Civil War, Americans in both the North and South applied their technological genius to the weapons of war. The Civil War witnessed the introduction of railroad artillery, military telegraph and railroads, landmines and telescopic sights, ironclad ships, and submarines. Lincoln found the new gadgets fascinating. He encouraged balloons for battlefield observations, tested new rifles, and encouraged inventors. McClellan's army became the best equipped in history. New developments in firearms design improved accuracy and range, enabling soldiers to pick off oncoming troops from a long distance. The Spencer repeating carbine, which could fire 7 shots in less than 30 seconds, issued devastating blankets of fire. Battlefield casualties were horrendous. Soon the rifle and the trench ruled Civil War battlefields. Lincoln may have entered the Civil War to preserve the Union, but no matter how he defined the North's objectives, this was a war about slavery.
The Civil War was about both Union and slavery. It was first about Union because the South had seceded from the Union and went its own way. And if you were going to restore the Union, you had to keep the Union uppermost in people's minds. Most Northerners would fight for Union. Because of racism, they were not willing yet to fight against slavery, although in time they came to hate slavery because slavery strengthened the Southerners. Driven by the need for freedom, the war was transformed into a war for Union with no slavery, a war to, in effect, have government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but now a people that would include all rather than just some.
Free blacks offering to fight were turned away from recruiting offices and told that this was a white man's war.
Free blacks contribute by constantly petitioning both Congress and the President for the right to serve as soldiers in the Army, and for a clear statement from the President on what the fate of the slaves will be in the event of a Union victory. Frederick Douglass is very eloquent and very important in this movement. He besieges Lincoln. He's in Lincoln's office 3, 4, 5 times in those 3 years, demanding the right of black men to serve in the Army. And speaking in public, saying things like, there is no population in the country that loathes the slaveholders more than the slaves. Unleash the mighty power of black resentment.
Slaves working back on the farms and in the factories made it possible for Southern whites to fight in the field. To break the Confederate war machine, Lincoln realized he would have to raise the stakes. With the first big Union victory at Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves still held by enemies of the Union would be free as of January 1st, 1863. Soon after, the Union Army allowed black men to fight for freedom. While the proclamation was a great step forward, it did not end slavery, for it allowed slaveholders in border states faithful to the Union to keep their slaves. Slavery would not finally end until ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865. But the first great step had been taken, and the next seemed sure to follow. Black men and women took to the streets cheering Lincoln. The proclamation meant the North was no longer fighting just for the Union. It was fighting for the establishment of a nation without slavery. Southern slaves decided to emancipate themselves by running away to Union lines by the tens of thousands.
African Americans began fighting in the Civil War almost from the beginning of the Civil War, even though they were not formally recruited. And a remarkable experiment was launched there, known as the Port Royal Experiment, to answer every question that white people in the North might have had about slaves. Would they work without compulsion? If freed, would they go and attack white people? If they had to defend themselves, would they do so, or would they shrink back in fear? In order to protect this experiment, it was necessary to arm some slaves, in effect to give them uniforms. And this was the 1st South Carolina Regiment. This isn't the regiment you see in the movie Glory. That comes later. The 1st Regiment was actually made up of slaves whose status as slaves or free people was not even assured. This is before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. So blacks were fighting from the very beginning. But it wasn't until after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued that it became legally possible to enroll blacks in the military. And roughly about 200,000 blacks served in the Union Army and Navy before the war was over. Absolutely essential to Union victory.
Frederick Douglass rejoiced when blacks could enlist. He sent 2 of his own sons, but he believed the restriction against black officers was wrong.
It is a little cruel to say to the black soldier that he shall not rise to be an officer of the United States, whatever may be his merits. But I see that coupled with this disadvantage, colored men should hail the opportunity of getting on the United States uniform as a great advantage.
May 17, 1863. Black troops charged the Confederate fortifications at Port Hudson, Louisiana. 4 times they charge into intense rebel fire. 4 times they suffer withering losses. Seeing black soldiers' courage in battle helped change people's minds about the wisdom of Lincoln's decision.
If we are defeated, it will be by the people at home. Atlanta Southern Confederacy.
While soldiers fought gunfire on the front, those left behind fought discouragement and want at home. Wartime shortages drove prices so high in the South that many people could not afford food even when it was available. They blamed merchants for setting high prices for a profit. In Richmond, Mary Jackson led 300 armed women into stores demanding better prices for food. An angry mob joined them, smashing windows and doors. Jefferson Davis finally came to quiet them, and Jackson was arrested. More bread riots erupted in Atlanta, New Orleans, and other southern cities. The North faced its own trouble at home. Not everyone supported the war. Northern Democrats denounced what they called Mr. Lincoln's War. Working-class men in northern cities resented competing for jobs with the growing number of African Americans fleeing north. They resented being forced to fight a war for black freedom. When Congress began a draft in 1863, riots broke out in northern cities. The worst took place in New York City in July 1863. The new draft law allowed a man to pay a substitute to take his place in the Army. Many poor workers, especially Irish Americans, were forced to serve. The drawing of the first draftees' names in New York triggered a 3-day riot by mobs of white workers who plundered rich people's houses, then turned their anger on blacks.
Many men were killed and thrown into rivers. A great number hung to trees and lampposts. Numbers were shot down. No black person could show their heads. They were hunted like wolves. Christian Recorder.
The government had to rush troops from the Gettysburg Campaign to stop the rioting. When it was all over, 74 people lay dead.
The suffering of men in battle is nothing next to the agony that women feel sending forth their loved ones to war.
Women at home in the North and South struggled to fill in for missing men, working in factories, running the family farm. In the South, women planted and plowed on small farms and struggled to manage huge plantations with little help. Many women sewed shirts, knit socks, and made bandages to send to soldiers. Others taught school to newly liberated slaves. A few women served as soldiers and spies. Frances Cleland dressed as a man and fought in the Missouri Cavalry. Historians estimate that as many as 400 women did the same. Despite bad pay, terrible conditions, and sometimes hostile treatment from officers, thousands of women served as Army nurses.
The doctors in the Union Army didn't want these women. They said they'll just interfere with what we're doing. They won't be able to stand the gory scenes of blood and destruction that we have to deal with, and they won't do a good job, and we don't want them. The women went anyway.
Dorothea Dix organized and headed all-female Union Army nurses. Northern women also organized a sanitary commission and went to work improving horrible conditions in disease-ridden hospitals. On the field, surgeons stood over men like butchers, chopping legs and arms and throwing them in a gory heap. Thousands died from infection. Nurses did their best to keep soldiers and operating rooms clean.
In fact, the Civil War marks the beginning of what we might call the nursing profession. Women like Clara Barton, women like Dorothea Dix were very much involved in creating the new profession of nursing. And after the Civil War, women could go to nursing schools and have careers as nurses, which was never possible for them to do before.
Clara Barton found her place anywhere between the bullet and the battlefield. She often arrived before the gunfire stopped to feed men and dig bullets from their flesh. A surgeon was asked, "Now, what do you think of Miss Barton?" He replied,
"In my feeble estimation, General McClellan, with all his laurels, sinks into insignificance beside the true heroine of the age, the angel of the battlefield."
July 1st, 1863. Townspeople in Gettysburg sought shelter when they saw troops marching toward their crossroads town. Gambling that a victory on Northern soil would win foreign recognition of the Confederacy and force the Union to the peace table, Robert E. Lee had marched his army north into Pennsylvania. The battle began when Confederate troops under A.P. Hill stumbled into Union cavalry near the town of Gettysburg, where there was rumored to be a large supply of shoes that the Confederates sorely needed. As more and more troops joined the action, battle lines became tangled in thick smoke. Struggling against superior numbers, Union troops fell back to strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill. For 3 days, soldiers fought hand to hand. The battle, unplanned and uncontrollable, was one of the war's most memorable because of its enormous destruction, intricate tactical maneuvers, and high stakes. When fighting finally ended on the 4th of July, 51,000 men lay dead or wounded. The Confederates had retreated, but there was so much death and rubble, it wasn't clear who had won. Lee's defeat was one of 2 heavy blows to the Confederacy. In the West, the loss of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in 2. Lee understood what had happened and offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who rejected it. Gettysburg had been the most deadly battle ever fought in North America. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln delivered a short speech to dedicate part of the battlefield as a cemetery. He spoke for only a few short minutes, but his words stirred the nation.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
If the South won, Lincoln implied, the great American experiment in democracy would end. American freedom would end. The Union must persevere. While events at Gettysburg were changing the course of the war in the East, out west, General Ulysses S. Grant was winning hard-fought Union victories. Unconditional surrender Grant, they called him, after he had refused to accept anything but an immediate and unconditional surrender. All through the winter of 1862 and 63, he had laid siege to the town of Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederates finally surrendered.
Yesterday, we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. The Confederacy taught us to its destruction.
Farther west, Indian nations were also becoming entangled in the war. white settlers continued to move into Indian territories, disregarding treaties and promises. The North was also eager to bring Western territories into the Union as free states and worried that Confederates were luring Native Americans to fight for the South.
And it is an interesting story in that we don't usually think of Indians being slaveholders or indeed Indians lining up with the Confederacy. You'd say, why wouldn't Native Americans line up with freedom since they had so little of their own? Those Indians who had slaves, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw owned slaves, not all of them, tended to line up with the Confederacy. Those who didn't, for a variety of reasons, might line up with the Union. Chiefs like Stan Wadey or Chief John Ross, they were generals, and they fought largely in the Western theater, although a few ended up here in the Eastern theater. But they looked to their own interest, as you would expect anybody to do during the war.
November 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado. Some 550 Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians are camped along Sand Creek for the winter. Union soldiers had promised they would not harm them. Then, as the sun begins to rise, Colorado volunteers crashed into the village, shooting and yelling. Cheyenne chief Black Kettle frantically ties an American flag and white flag of peace to a long pole and hoists it up in front of his teepee. Ignoring the flags, the soldiers slaughter men, women, and children.
A war in the West was largely being prosecuted against various Indian groups by Union soldiers in the effort not just to secure the West for the Union during the Civil War, but the war became an occasion for people who wanted to push the Indians out. And so you had massacres, such as the Sand Creek Massacre, where efforts, in effect, to use the larger war to justify the annihilation of one's enemies.
Anti-Indian violence, like the massacre at Sand Creek, poisoned Indian-white relations. As the number of incidents increased, volunteer troops stepped up their activities to meet what they called the growing Indian threat. In March 1864, Abraham Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant Lieutenant General, a post last held by George Washington. Grant now controlled the Union's 500,000 soldiers. Lincoln had, at long last, found the man he was looking for. Grant was tough, decisive, and unrelenting. Grant moved his army southward, inflicting heavy losses on the Confederates in his Wilderness Campaign. "Wherever Lee goes, I go," he vowed, as he mounted constant assaults on the Confederates.
People in the North were shocked at the losses after Cold Harbor. They were piling up bodies, literally. It was said at Cold Harbor you could walk from one end of the battlefield to the other across dead Union soldiers and your foot would never touch the ground, but it would be soaked in blood that would go all the way up to your knees. People in the North said, "What? We can't continue with this." But Grant knew that he must continue it because the only way to beat Lee was to destroy his army. And if you destroyed Lee's army, then you would destroy the last vestige of Southern resistance. No Southerner would stand after Lee had fallen.
Grant wanted to strike a death blow, something that would break the spirit of the Confederacy. He gave William Tecumseh Sherman 100,000 troops and orders to march all the way to Atlanta. Sherman tore his way through the South, finally capturing and burning the city of Atlanta, the military supply and rail center of the Deep South.
As far as the eye could reach, the lurid flames of burning houses lit up the heavens. I could stand out on the veranda and for 2 or 3 miles watch the Yankees as they came on.
After Atlanta, he made the decision to cut himself off from just following another Confederate army and to move across the richest counties in the Confederacy. He had studied census materials to find out what are the richest counties, and he was going to go from Atlanta to the sea. He was going to cut, as he said, a bloody swath and devour everything in his path. If they couldn't eat it, living on their bellies, what the Confederacy had for them to take, then they would destroy it. And the purpose of this was to let every Southerner know, because even those not hit directly would learn. Let every Southerner know that we can move at will. I can move an army across a state and you can't stop us. And if I can move it there, I can move it anywhere. I will destroy you. That's a modern concept of total war. It shocked people in the middle of the 19th century. It shocks people still, but it worked.
The fall of Atlanta cheered the public back home and helped Abraham Lincoln win re-election over Democrat George McClellan, his former commander-in-chief, who ran on a platform that denounced the war as a failure and called for a negotiated peace with the South. In early 1865, the last Confederate strongholds began to fall. Confederates abandoned Charleston, South Carolina, Petersburg, and Richmond, Virginia. Black soldiers were among the earliest troops to march through the cities.
I am 69 years old, but I feel as if I want but 16.
Then you are glad the Yankees are here?
Oh, child, I doesn't call you Yankees. I call you Jesus AIDS.
Close to 190,000 African Americans had served their country during the course of the war, 1/5 of the total.
Can those be men? The dead there are not to be pitied as much as some of the living. Walt Whitman.
A Union medical worker, Walt Whitman couldn't believe his eyes when he visited Fort Bell, a prison camp in Virginia. Thousands of Union troops starved or died of disease in Confederate prisons. In the North, Camp Morton was considered a model camp, but nearly 1,700 Confederates died there during the war. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Cheering and flags joined the black banners and cries of Lincoln's mourners. After 4 years of fighting and the loss of more than 600,000 lives, the Civil War was finally over. The end of the war marked a major turning point in United States history. The war had stimulated industrialization and new ways of conducting business. African Americans had won freedom. Native Americans lost ground in the West. The American South was devastated, its economy shattered, its towns and cities in ruins. Remaining before the nation lay new challenges, some of them as complicated and controversial as the war itself. Under what terms should the Southern states be readmitted to the Union? Should they be forgiven or punished? Now that the nation had abolished slavery, what should become of the 3.5 million African Americans released from bondage?